Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today's topic is lessons and explanations that can be gained or understand through left-wing violence or left-wing arguments regarding violence. The context, well, today is January 27th, 2023, and the city of Memphis has stated that they are going to release the body cam footage regarding the death of Tyree Nichols. And since I have not seen it and I am not participating in that at this time, we're not actually going to spend a great deal or any time really regarding why or what is going on in that case. Rather, we're going to address how we can understand arguments made by the left in regards to understanding violence. And the two big topics that are the two big terms that tend to get brought up are one, Antifa or Antifa, however you want to pronounce it, as well as preemptive self-defense. The things that can be gained from this and it can be understood from it is a little bit more clarification on what we understand violence to be and how it exists. So for today, thank you for joining us on this Friday solo of the Redacted Culture Cast, getting released a little bit later in the day because I needed some time to read up on all of the stuff that I wanted to finish talking about, and it's always better to produce a better product in this case. If you enjoy the show, we appreciate it if you leave things like a like or subscribe, or you leave commentary on the YouTube publications. We're also live on Spotify. We're available on Spotify and other podcast applications. Anytime you leave a rating, we do appreciate it. It's the algorithm that we live in, not necessarily the one that we want, but we're thankful for your time. If you want to continue to support the show, head over to redactedllc.com. That's where you'll find our merch, and we are going to get right into the topic. So, in the at least last, let's just say 3 years of at least American politics at writ large, the term violence has been brought up quite a bit. Whether or not you refer to Donald Trump as a fascist or as a president or whatever it is, at least that language has become somewhat center stage, at least since 2020. The question we would want to start with is, what is left-wing violence? And unfortunately, that's a tricky situation because one of the primary goals when engaging in sort of clandestine warfare is to obfuscate the connections between various peoples and parties. But today, when we're referring to left-wing violence, I have a stack of authors and books that I've read that represent key ideological points across the spectrum, from the high academic to the low kind of, I wouldn't say like low as in like low mentality, but like the closest to the population, highest to the ivory tower, lowest to the ground level, examples of arguments made from left-wing characters about things that they refer to as violence. The word Antifa is going to be brought up multiple times in this subject, and the reason why I refer to Antifa is because I have, fortunately or unfortunately, read the Antifa handbook. I'm using a little bit of their definition and a little bit of how the definitions have evolved to understand what we mean when we refer to this thing called Antifa or even fascism. In addition to that, when I'm talking about left-wing violence, I'm still referring to violence that is propagated or perpetrated by characters who fit within the left-wing ideology being, well, even more ambiguous at this point, but also by art movements like Black Lives Matter and Antifa. So let's begin. The first element and the things that we're going to be dealing with in today's conversation are one of the ways that we're going to be looking at these arguments is trying to understand the ethical and metaphysical claims that are being made. And the why we have to distinguish those from each other will kind of play out, especially when we look at some of the later writings. But it is most clear when we refer to Antifa. So Antifa, or in the Anti-Fascist Handbook, we're looking at, we start to see this idea of preemptive self-defense come out in terms. Here's the thing about addressing the subject of preemptive self-defense. It stems from a bit of an ethical dilemma in regards to conflict between peoples. For example, if I can know with absolute certainty that a certain person or persons are going to attempt to do harm upon me, at what point in time is it ethical, not arguing legal, ethical to engage in what you would refer to as self-defense? Or is it possible that self-defense in any sort of ethical framework be considered, or can self-defense in any sort of framework be considered ethical if it is preemptive? There are two sides to the way that we look at this. One of them is the way that the military and some forms of law enforcement have struggled in the last 2 decades regarding rules of engagement. While in the military, if you encounter people who have been in the military or veterans, they might express the frustration on how the rules of engagement don't seem to have the on the ground skin in the game representation that they would have if the person who is engaging in the rules of engagement actually had skin in the game. That's a bit of a circular statement. Another way of saying it is, one of the problems that I experienced in the military, and many others have, is that the rules of engagement are being written by people who don't have skin in the game, and as a result, their version and understanding of the ethical requirements expected of soldiers does not accurately represent the battlefield. If you were to read Nicholas Nassim Taleb's book Skin in the Game, you would be able to what this refers to when it comes to violence, or especially the military, is that the people who are closest to the event are more likely to have a better understanding of the circumstances that are involved in the possible violent encounter. Whereas the further one is away from it, whether physically or metaphorically, as in like, I'm not responsible for the decisions or whatever, the further one is from that kind of scenario, the less accurate and wise, perhaps is another way of saying it, the less accurate or the worse their perspective is going to be on the subject. If you were to read On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, I apologize for the rank slip up. If you're going to read On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, he makes an observation, perhaps an argument, that the further people, as history progressed and we became better at killing people from further distances, it produced an effect on the psyche, on the decision-making process that the individuals were making. He said the intimacy of a knife fight is much different, is considerably different than the completely disconnected feeling of clicking buttons on a mouse and dropping bombs on people. So, skin in the game. So what we're talking about when it comes to things like preemptive self-defense and how it would have played out, and why I think it's important for us to consider, even if we have disagreements with left-wing ideology, is to use arguments that we may disagree with and use writings from people who have different perspectives from us, even if it's simply to find out that we don't agree with them, or more importantly, to look at how beliefs that we hold come to conclusion. For example, you might want to read something like Mein Kampf to understand not only what Hitler was thinking, but why it was wrong. We might want to read things like the Antifa Handbook, or engage in philosophies on violence different than our own, not so that we can be affirmed in our beliefs, but so we can understand them better. It is always more painful to read something that you agree with, read or something that you believe in, agreed with, and saw to a fuller potential in somebody who manifested the outcome that was terrible. We would hate to be foolish in our mindset. We'd hate to be fools remaining simple in our mindset, only to find out that we were ineffective walking down the road to hell. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, but those intentions aren't really all that good when we refuse to do due diligence to understand what we believe and why we believe. To let the room breathe a minute. In summary, the understanding, or one example of why we would want to understand how the left views preemptive self-defense, is so that we can look at things like rules of engagement, not necessarily by a legal standpoint, but by an ethical perspective, to understand as individuals what and when and how the concept of self-defense is considered ethical. If we decide to skip over this subject and just say, well, I was defending my life, we can find ourselves manipulated into, quote unquote, defending our life assertively. In other words, we'll believe that we're defending ourselves, but in fact, we're the aggressors. Or another example of it would be, we can say that the rules of engagement that were given to us in the military or in law enforcement are wrong, but now we can understand why and describe how. There is a kind of a one side versus the other, not politically, but we're trying to put up left and right limits on what we understand when it comes to violence. Because I think we can universally state, at least in some extent, that violence über alles is a bad political philosophy, and it's ineffective, and it's also an immoral one, regardless of philosophical foundations, which would be a little bit of a pitfall. I know that can go a little awry. So to begin, in Mark Bray's book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, on page 169, he says, in other words, anti-fascists don't wait for a fascist threat to become violent before acting to shut it down, physically if necessary. There is an implication here. We're addressing the ethics of the use of force. And Mark Bray, in this element of the Anti-Fascist Handbook, when he says, when we shut it down with force if necessary, was writing about how what he was referring to, Antifa, using violence to prevent the organization or to disrupt organization by people they deem to be fascist. This is where we've seen in political discourse one of the main issues with this idea that is referred to as anti-fascism comes in. And it's where the criticism is oftentimes thrown at different levels at this idea called anti-fascism is, if you're going to be against something, you better be damn good at defining what it is. Because the limiting principle would argue that if you are incapable of defining what fascism is, then you cannot be considered in opposition to it. If the definition of what you refer to as fascism is too broad, and it necessarily then will not necessarily, and will result in people who are innocent being caught up in it and caught in your ire, in this term, it will face your violence, then what you are doing is considered immoral because you are not considering collateral damage, or you are considering and disregarding collateral damage. The use of force, we believe, at least within ethics, and I think the argument is pretty, I wouldn't say like self-justifying, but pretty straightforward in the sense of we can make a statement that the use of force is only justified against people who are who deserve the use of force to be used against them. Or in other words, the use of force is determined, the ethical requirements of the use of force are dependent on, are not dependent on, the ethical requirements of use and force must consider who that force is used against. So this is where you can get into things like, when on a legal sense, the statements that are made, it is better that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent man be sentenced. This is an argument where a war becomes unjustified when it produces more collateral damage than effective, effective targeting. You could kind of distill the idea from that. And what the Antifa handbook is implying is that people who are fascists will always and eventually become violent and attack you. And so in order to stop fascism, we must stop it with violence if necessary before fascism becomes violence. And how does it define fascism? That is a consistent line. This idea of preemptive self-defense is consistent through left-wing political left-wing understandings of violence. There are two key elements that I'll argue that define left-wing violence as far as how it functions, not what its motive is, not what its direction is, not what its arguments are in regards to whether or not its ideology is sound, but within our understanding of violence, there are two main factors. We've begun addressing the first. The preemptive use of self-defense is primarily consistent across left-wing literature. and it looks something like this. We know that they, whoever we are talking about, will become violent or intend to become violent. Therefore, we are justified in using force to prevent said violence. Before we just distill that into the pure negativity or positivity of like politics as a whole, we need to understand what that claim can be said first in a steel man before we kind of go into a straw man. And we should probably stay out of the straw man side. But what it is saying is that we are somehow capable of knowing that somebody is going to attempt to do violence upon us or some peoples. Therefore, we are justified in using force if necessary to prevent that from happening. Let's break this down in the idea of a simple one person and two people involved self-defense case. If one person threatens to attack you, at one point in time, are you justified, not legally, but ethically, in using self-defense? I'm saying not legally on purpose, not because I don't want to engage in the legality of it, but that's not what this conversation is about today. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'd love to sit down with another lawyer or a lawyer and have a conversation about this from a legal perspective, and then how that legality might need to change. But as far as an ethical standpoint, if what are some examples of this? If you send a message over a digital apparatus saying that you're going to hurt somebody, do I have justification? Or if somebody makes a death threat online, does the receiver of that death threat have justification to go to the sender's house and enact preemptive self-defense? I think the answer is no. The reason for that is the person is not facing immediate threat. And there's discernment that needs to be happened here. Let's change it a little bit. What happens if two people are standing in proximity of each other and one threatens to do harm, great bodily harm, or kill the other person? Is the receiver of the threat justified in using violence? The answer is maybe, because they have to be able to make an assessment. And this is where the ethics lie. Whether or not it's legal, you have to make an ethical assessment on whether or not their threat is genuine, and they're going to see it through, and they're capable of doing it. So there are multiple layers of the problem here. Now, you may make a mistake on the capability argument. You may overassess and underassess your target, your not oppressor, offender, the person making the threat. You may overassess their abilities. Say, well, this person could have a weapon and doesn't, and the possession of a weapon does not imply the intent to use it. We're just going to deny that right away. The person may or may not have a weapon. They may or may not be skilled in combat. They may or may not have the ability to fight me. They may or may not have other people involved. They may or may not. Okay, so you can make that assessment. And I think we can say with a certain amount of ethical certainty to always assume that a person making a threat is fully capable of exercising that threat, executing that threat. If we are always to assume the maximum effectiveness of the individual, we're walking on ethical quicksand, because that very quickly becomes anyone who threatens me, I'm going to respond with maximum force. From an honor code system, not good. From a dignity system, not good. Also, that implies that you're not required to think and consider other people. I'm not saying consider them like consider their feelings, but I'm saying it's a little bit solipsistic at best. Second element in this metaphorical self-defense case. This metaphorical self-defense situation. So metaphorical self-defense situation, we implied that they have to make the statement and have the capability and then some like immediacy or something like that. And the statement, the intent, and the capability. Evaluating intent is very difficult, sort of. In other words, we know that there is more to communication than words. There's body language, there's context. There's body language and there's context. There's more to communication than just the words that are spoken. We do not live in a perfectly literal world when it comes to communication. First of all, because we are human beings, we are prone to error, we are prone to misinterpretation. So the interpretation of intent is probably where most ethical gray zones lie. We can say that on the capability side, the gray zone is pretty small. When we can say on the intent, the gray zone is a little bit wider because I mean, if a person's going to say they're threatening to kill you, are you responsible for divining whether or not their intent is genuine or not? Yes and no. Like yes and no. It's kind of a weird way of saying it. And then finally, then there is like the statement itself. And maybe the rule of thumb is if you want to understand people who are actually good at violence, they very rarely state that they're going to do violence. This is a ethical weight that applies with maturity. It's an ethical weight that applies with maturity. Maybe another good example of it is whether by myth or by reality, all the people who are really good at violence, most of the people who are really good at violence, whether it's timing or capability, rarely flippantly make threats. And that's important. I think we can say, at least within a bit of a parable sense, the person who makes many threats will not be taken seriously, but the person who makes few threats will be, especially if he is perceived at being capable of following through with them. This is not talking about morals. This is talking about ethics. And so we know that people who regularly make death threats, maybe you have your Call of Duty voice in real life. It's hard to take those seriously. Is the person who is being threatened responsible for how seriously they take those threats? Yes and no. This becomes a little bit of maybe both can be wrong. But maybe both can be wrong. Maybe there is no good answer in this question. Now, returning to definitions and understanding of left-wing violence. This is where all of these things become very, very tricky. When we are addressing the concept of the ethical use of force in a form of self-defense, we believe, generally speaking, maybe not we, but I will make the argument that it is true that the use of force is only ethical when the individual, the use of force in self-defense is only ethical when the person is under assault, not like you're currently being assaulted, but when the presence and the presence of threat, the presence and intent of threat are both, when the capability and intent of threat are both present. I'm not original in this idea, but then also that the person has committed to understanding it. I'm not trying to add more layers. What do I mean by committed to understanding it? In other words, that it is only ever acceptable to use force when you accept the ethical framework by which the use of force is participated in. To even make it, I'm sorry that I'm not making it less complicated. I need to distill it one more time. It is only ethical to use force in self-defense when there is the intent that has been observed, which you are making an assessment on. The capability is present, which you are making an assessment on, and you believe both of those are valid and against you. Then you can ethically use force in a form of self-defense. That means you can't wait for it to happen. Or no, you can't use it before both factors are present. But it is because you are viewing the aggressor as a human being who is capable of making decisions, who is capable of making choices, and you must accept that the human being making a threat against you must, 1, show intent, must, 2, be capable, and must, 3, be viewed by the threatenee as a human. Otherwise, it's not really self-defense. You have to understand that is a human being doing that. If you dehumanize them, if you disregard them as a human being, then it becomes something else. Then I don't think it's really technically self-defense. I think it becomes something else. Now, why does this apply to left-wing violence? Two elements that I think would determine left-wing violence are, as understood through the Antifa handbook and other examples, which we'll get to quickly. One element is this idea of preemptive self-defense, and that is, I know that you are going to try to use violence against me because of your ideology, because of what your skin color, I guess. We could do the anti-racism argument, But and this actually kind of draws into the second one, which is a metaphysical statement about peoples. A metaphysical categorization of peoples between the fascists and the anti-fascists, or the right and the left, the good and the bad, the far right, the far left, the whatever, the white supremacists and the anti-fascists, or whatever you want to call it. Like, it is the fundamental ethical pitfall of left-wing violence is the metaphysical categorization of people who can't do anything other than be bad. In other words, a fascist will always do fascist things. How do I say this how do I make this more clear? The view of the anti-fascist, according to Mark Bray, in the anti-fascism, as presented by the book, is that fascists are effectively a different metaphysical category of being who will always and who are by nature always going to end up producing fascism. Whatever fascism is to them, it seems to be a moving target, but we can let that go for a while. It's simply, there is a categorical difference between an anti-fascist and a fascist, and they are not both human beings. They are different types of beings. That is a primary difference between ethics and metaphysics. Let me restate that. One key element that is consistent across left-wing literature regarding violence is that the people that they are referring to as the white supremacists or the fascists or the far right or the alt-right or the Trumpists or the Trumpianism or the whatever it is, fundamentally describe them as a metaphysical category of a different type of people who are by nature going to produce some sort of violence against the author, therefore justifying the use of self-defense. In other words, they're almost dehumanizing their target to the level of an animal, saying that a lion will always attack a man or a gazelle or whatever. You know, they're the one, and that the author is part of one, let's just call it subspecies, and the author's target is who are deserving, according to the author, of preemptive self-defense, is of a different subspecies who will always prey on the author's group. And as a result, kind of a hidden third point, is that the left wing in these books view violence as a scale, as a continuum, not as an on or off switch. There's an observation that was made by, in a private conversation with Austin, who we had on the show a while ago, who talked about tactical maturity. And he also talked about the skill sets of the non-soft individual, the non-special operations guy, which I thank you for viewing that as much as you did. It was, I'm really thankful that conversation went really well. But if you haven't listened to it, I suggest it. It's a bit long. Trust me, it gets good. But there is the right views, at least in America, or at least the American political right, views violence, like the Second Amendment people, at least a lot of gun culture, tends to view violence as like an on or an off switch. It's a black and a white. You're either being violent or you're being nonviolent. Whereas the left, at least in this literature that I've been reading, that I've read, views it a little bit more in a continuum. Like, whether or not it's technically violence is very, very gray. Because on the one hand, speech is violence, and then on the other hand, silence is violence. And on the one hand, using force to preemptively defend oneself against somebody else's future fascism is actually not violence, but suggesting that that anti-fascism is an ideology would also then be considered violence. It's not simply that it's muddy, it's that it's a continuum, that in another way, violence starts with a statement, leads to a shove, continues with a punch, moves to a knife, then concludes with a gun and a bomb and a tank. And so that violence escalates, we believe in the idea of the escalation of force and the de-escalation of force. So in a sense, the right kind of sees it both ways. But when it comes to the ethics of violence, the left sees it as a moral black and white, but in application, a continuum, whereas the right sees it as a moral continuum with an ethical black and white. I'll restate that. The difference between right-wing and left-wing perspectives of violence is that the right views the use of force as a continuum, but the ethics of violence as a black and white. The left, however, views it oppositely. The use of violence, the right views, gosh, I just made it so convoluted. The right views the use of force as an ethical black and white, as an ethical continuum. Sometimes it can be used, sometimes it can't be used. But it sees the use of force. I'm just making it even more confusing. Let's restate this one more time. The left wing, the left, in accordance to this argument, sees the use of force as a continuum, that it changes in perspective of what, whether or not a thing is determined to be use of force changes. However, the use of force is an ethical black and white based on the metaphysical constitution of the individual acting on it. So a anti-fascist doing violence is actually not violence, whereas a fascist doing non-violence is actually violence. On the right, it's the opposite. On the right, a thing is either violent or it is not violent. An act is either violent or I am either using force or I am not using force. But whether or not it is ethical exists on a slider scale of context and relationship between peoples. Now, where I think the right gets it wrong is that force is not a single on or off switch. It is an escalation of force. I'm talking about American political right at this point in time. And where the left gets it wrong is it's not purely just ethical. Their metaphysic of its ethic is kind of wonky. To further exemplify my point, I move on to Bring the War Home by Kathleen Bellow. And in this book, there's a statement on page 106. Vigilantism should be understood as violence that served to constitute, shore up, and enforce systemic power. That is to say, not only overt power wielded by the state, but also the many informal structures that upheld law and order. Now, Kathleen Bellow writes a really good book called Bring the War Home, where she's addressing this thing called the white power movement and paramilitary America, primarily within post-Vietnam America. Spends a lot of time talking about things like the Klan and white supremacy, and you get a lot of her ideas out of this. It's a thankfully academically approached book, and I think it's a good one. I don't agree with her. I don't agree with her conclusions, though. I think that she takes a couple pitfalls, which is not for the point of this conversation. However, she does an excellent job explaining what she believes to be vigilantism. It's only vigilantism when it's done by the white power people. Kind of is an oversimplification of what she's saying. Now, why is that relevant? Well, I think the issue with or what this reveals about these arguments in regards to understanding violence is that vigilantism was, in this definition, defined as being used as is predefined by whether or not it is used to enforce the powers that be or the state of things whatsoever. But it gets also well defined. I'd put Kathleen Bellow. Let's draw a tower here. The top of the ivory tower is Barbara F. Walter with How Civil War Start. Right below her would be Kathleen Bellow. I think Kathleen Bellow would be a little bit described as an up and coming. So both Bring the War Home and How Civil War Start address the concept of the threat of right-wing violence and right-wing, I don't want to call it nationalism or populism or whatever, but they both imply that in time going forward, because Bring the War Home does focus on post-Vietnam War, it moves on to contemporary events, our day and age. And both her book and How Civil War Start, which Barbara Walter does an excellent job describing factors that could not preconceptual, like factors that point to the likelihood of a civil war happening. It's not pre-necessary conditions, but let's just call it warning signs. Warning signs that a nation is about to engage, a nation or region is about to engage in civil war. She does that excellently. And then she contorts reality. She contorts the reality of American politics to fit her predetermined conclusion to be true. And she does that in the opening chapter, where she uses an event that has been otherwise discredited as evidence for her argument, and then continues to kind of scatter those in. And the other compartment of it that you see identified in this one is she'll write a paragraph that's a series of statements that are like, historical statements, and then she'll include an imperative in there. Not an imperative. She'll include another statement like that is masked as a fact statement about something that doesn't belong in that category. So it would be like, roses are red, violets are blue, fascists are everywhere, apples are green, you know what I mean? And you just kind of, or it would be like, the table is brown, the wall behind me is teal, the books behind me are of mixed different colored, they have different color covers and stuff. Trump is a fascist. The house I'm living in is generally square in shape. I live on a street. And so there's a fact statement, a fact statement, a fact statement, a fact statement. But one of those is not like the other. My hair is brown. My eyes are blue. My skin is pale. I'm wearing a black T-shirt. And Antifa eats babies, or something like that. You get this idea of like, it's one sentence that that is injected into a paragraph that sort of relies on the sort of reasonableness of all the other statements, but then gets added into there, and it feels like it's clearly added in to try to kind of sneak it in. Now, I would expect something better, but we are humans and we are prone to failure. So Kathleen Bellow in How Civil Wars Start makes a statement on page 159. In this stage, the extremists are trying to force the population to choose sides, in part by demonstrating to citizens that government cannot keep them safe and provide basic necessities. And what she's doing in this part of the chapter is that she has gone on to describe this would be chapter referring to the 2020 election and January 6th. This is an example of how she is placing the onus of responsibility on the right. And this is chapter 6, how close are we, as in how close are we to civil war? She's placing the onus on the right, or what she's referring to as the right, for being responsible for doing something while absolving somebody else of doing the exact same thing. What we are seeing here is there is evidence of insurgent penetration and subversion of the military, police, and intelligence services. She's making that statement as if the right has infiltrated whatever the right is, and her definition of the right is a little bit back to that metaphysical construct, is such a threat that it is trying to undermine the very existence of the United States. Right-wing terrorism used to rise and fall depending on who was president. It increased when a Republican was in the White House, or it decreased when a Republican was in the White House, and increased when a Democrat was in power. And then she says President Trump broke the pattern for the first time. Violent right-wing groups increased their activity during a Republican administration. The fact is that all violence increased during the end of Donald Trump's presidency. And it's rather obvious why. Our society broke down into almost pure chaos for months, as we had riots and protests that were somehow described as peaceful protests. And that is kind of the key. So this is, again, this is a metaphysical description of the person's detractors as being necessarily evil by their constitution, and then blaming the right to use, or blaming them for the problems that be. Remember, the fundamental argument that we're trying to pull in here is understanding how we think about violence, not making a criticism. And I know I'm going to say I'm not necessarily a fan of Barbara Walter, but need a drink. Sorry. But the reading of it is important so we can understand how we think about violence. A consistent necessary element to the concept of preemptive self-defense that is consistent across the left is the idea that if I can determine that somebody is a Nazi or a far-right extremist or whatever is no longer a human being, but more a fascist than a human being. They are not, and I am not doing violence against them. I am culling the herd. I am not doing violence against a human being. I am doing some form of self-defense. The primary element that's been consistent across these formats of the primary element, the primary distinction that's made when these with these different arguments on violence coming from the left is that if I can categorize somebody as a thing and on a metaphysical level, which is functionally dehumanization, then my actions are justified based on what that person is. This goes back to, is it okay to punch a Nazi? We've heard this argument before. It's not really a new one, but it also applies to people in conflict. Let's just say you are in war, right? You are a soldier in war, whether it is a concept like World War II, World War III for that matter, or the global war on terror or special operations or whatever. Whether or not you're using force for self-defense, you're on a police force. The ethics of violence are not determined by recategorizing people as different things other than people. The use of force against a person is only ethical when that person is understood to be a human being. You're a human, they're a human, violence happens between humans. It only happens ethically between humans within a certain framework and context. If we dehumanize the other person, we void any ethical position that we stand on. This is not an argument to be made that people do things that are wrong or right or whatever. It is an internal observation. At this point in time, across these three books so far, it appears that the authors of those books are incapable of understanding or unwilling, not incapable, we're not metaphysically determining them as capable or incapable, unwilling to consider that their opponents are human beings like themselves. And thus, we're looking at a road to hell is paved in good intentions situation. But probably the best example of this would be the book, and we'll do this in closing, They Want to Kill Americans by Malcolm Nance. Now, Malcolm Nance is by no means considered to be a high intellectual within, he's not in the ivory tower. He's a little bit closer to the newscaster caste, CASTE, of communication. Let's make this statement. So in the book, They Want to Kill Americans, Malcolm Nance writes this, at least him or his ghostwriter. Titus, Titus, the Trump insurgency of the United States, is a pre-rebellion political paramilitary alliance that intends to use politics, instability, and violence to meet its goals. The number one goal is reestablishing the Trump dynasty as the primary operating system for America. Already sounds a little pathological. Then it will use the power of the government to punish its enemies. The political wing of Titus, the Trump-dominated Republican Party, has already initiated a dangerous plan to embrace the launch of protracted political warfare in America. More insidiously, the Trump insurgents are diabolically unified in their beliefs. They are a political party that suffered a stunning loss of power, losing the president, the House of Representatives, the Senate would usually make thoughtful, more mature politicians reevaluate their situation dispassionately. Not in this instance. Under Trump's guidance, Republicans are determined to chart the exact opposite course, which, as we move on to, let's see, what's the next one? Where's the right one? I guess the kind of the best argument of it would be where he makes the statement that the goal of the right, the Trump right, Bannon knew the power of raw fascism firsthand. He saw the visceral spittle-flecked hatred dredged up in the Republican base when Trump designated a race or class of people as an enemy at rallies. When Trump spewed insults and hate, the authoritarian genetics of the Republican base flashed to life in crowds swearing eternal enmity and vowing violence. And, in fact, physical attacks against protesters and news media occurred many times at Trump's rallies, with his smiling approval. Okay, so that's an interesting point. You're adding a lot of morality to a series of events that happened. And where is this? There's a common sentence that comes across on what he believes that the Trump insurgency in the United States wants to do, and it is the moment of ignoring insurrectionist threat is precisely when a guerrilla force is led by an upstart political group that will try to seize power. He makes this statement that, and I think it's profound and it's common throughout the whole book, that the objective of the right in the United States is to establish a monarchy of the Trump and then go after and kill the gays and the people of color. And you're like, and so this is the foundational. Yes. This is his foundational argument, is that whatever it is that is the right is so intent on doing so much violence that the only appropriate course of action for the United States is to institute a new or improved form of justice and a task force to target anybody who is right-wing. Now, what does that look like? Pure political violence. In this book, Malcolm Nance advocates for pure political violence, which, if you draw back to the French story, would be terrorism. But we're kind of moving beyond ourselves here. The final conclusion that could be taken, and this is a book that you read in ounces, not in pounds. But he makes the argument, and this is an example of what we can learn from forms of left-wing literature. And again, I'm using this as a reference to show kind of the far end, not the middle. But it does. Let me rephrase that. I wanted to conclude with Malcolm Nance's book, "They Want to Kill Americans," which makes the argument that whatever it is that he refers to as the right has the intent on instituting some form of government that will persecute and kill other Americans based on race or color or sexual orientation, and that this kind of desire for violence is coming from the right, and therefore we are justified in instituting a new legal apparatus and law enforcement agencies specifically to target people who have ties to that political party or that political view, which is not only interesting because he was a Navy intelligence guy, I believe, and the fundamental flaw in counterinsurgency, he refers to himself as what an insurgency expert, and as an insurgency expert, he fundamentally fails at the basic responsibility of the expert analyst in that field, and that is to determine when you are engaging with an insurgency, who is an insurgent and who is not. And instead of doing that, Malcolm Nance does the opposite. He paints everybody with that brush. Everybody who everyone who is I guess to the right of himself. At least that's what it sounds like in his book. And so I conclude with that to kind of rebuild the Tower of Babel from the bottom up. On the very lowest level, we started with Antifa and the Antifa handbook, which argues that on a societal level, this concept that is referred to as anti-fascism is simply the people exercising, or it is simply the people preventing fascism by happening through decentralized organization. Just how decentralized that is in question. But he is making the argument that there is this thing, this category referred to as a fascist, and it is the people, whoever the people are justified in using force if necessary to disrupt the activities of what they determine to be fascism. which is then harnessed to be used as with a population then can be harnessed like an arrow to be loosed from a bow aimed by a disingenuous actor maybe. But then we go up the tower. We're moving our way up the intellectual level to bring the war home, where Kathleen Bellow is addressing vigilantism, and she ties anti-communism with white supremacy, and she sort of correlates the two without saying they're causal, and then implies that evidence of anti-communism is also evidence of white supremacy through implication, not through overt statement. Don't want to put words in your mouth. I still respect you. But in her argument that she makes it a statement that the threat is coming from some form of new underground white supremacy, which gets a little boogeyman-ish. Moving all the way to the top, peak of the ivory tower, we have How Civil Wars Start by Barbara F. Walter, which categorizes right-wing violence as being insurgent. And she argues that the right is a category of violence that is intent on doing a thing, and that the right is going to try to start a civil war, meanwhile overlooking the things that are happening on the ground. I think Barbara Walter is an example of you've lost touch with what's happening in the world. You have a great theory that has been built on theory, that has been built on theory, that has been built on theory, that when you get to the foundation of it, it's turtles all the way down, honey. It's theories all the way down. Your theory of right-wing violence is misguided. And then we conclude with Malcolm Nance, who is not at the top. He's at the pundit level. So we go ivory tower, academic, pundit level, people level. The pundit level seems to address seems to exemplify it the best. And that is the danger. What do we have to learn from this? The difference between right-wing and left-wing violence, or what we can learn from reading left-wing violence, is how it categorizes people in terms of metaphysics and then applies ethical categories to them on top. Let me rephrase that. If I can define you within a metaphysical category, and that category comes with ethical conditions, then what I do on you, the ethical framework by which I exhibit things like force, violence, and self-defense is determined by your category. If I can conclude that you're of a different metaphysical category, then the rules of engagement change. If I can dehumanize you by saying you're a fascist or a Nazi or a far-wing protester or a Trumpist or whatever, if I can dehumanize you, then I can use violence against you. And we see this outcome and we say, that's wrong. Now we can look out into what we're referring to as left-wing violence and become frustrated by it. Or we can look in and try to understand within ourselves where we are our own selves dehumanizing other people, whether it's in conversation, whether it's in what we think and what we believe and what we understand to be true. Going back to the very beginning framework, no use of force against other human beings can be considered ethical if it comes only at the cost of dehumanizing that opponent. The necessary element, an element necessary for violence against another human being to be considered ethical, is that they are perceived as a human being. You must understand the truth that violence between people is violence between people, not violence between a human and an animal, or a Jedi and a Sith, or a Nazi and a anti-fascist, or whatever it is, a communist or whatever. Even though the people that are asserting the use of force are doing so by dehumanization, that does not justify us ourselves also dehumanizing that who we are talking about or talking to. In order for the use of force to be considered ethical, not talking legal, ethical, the individual who is using force against another human being must understand and see them as a human being. That way, that is necessary but not sufficient for the use of force to be ethical. We've understood this by reading and engaging in left-wing literature and how it categorizes people, as much as it tries to speak about equity and all that garbage. It categorizes people into the clean and the unclean, the holy and the unholy, the fascist and the anti-fascist, the Trumpist and the American, or whatever it is, and then justifies the use of force based on that pre-existing category. And we recognize that that is wrong. So as we get ready to go into this weekend, where for some of you, we don't know what it's going to look like across the country, the one thing that I ask of you is look after your people. Look after each other. We're going to be fine. We're going to make it through this. We're going to carry on. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for supporting the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening today. And if today is not January the 27th of 2023, we hope that the future is taking care of you well. Thank you for heading over to redactedllc.com, where you will find what our merch projects are. And we look forward to releasing Season 1, Operation 2 to you in the near future. Take care and see you soon.